And as always, as we've mentioned, whenever we're talking here about davening, the goal here is it's an intellectual exercise that is meant to ultimately bring more meaning to our davening and to our daily tefillah. So the last couple of weeks, we've really mentioned two main approaches to why we daven. The first approach we had seen was that we daven, number one, for practical purposes in order to be able to receive certain things from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whether it's things that we weren't supposed to get and we beg HaKadosh Baruch Hu for them, or as we even highlighted, was even things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is planning on giving us. Tefillah becomes the mechanism through which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us those things. The second approach we saw last week was more of an approach that was focused less on getting things from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but more on the impact that davening can have in our connection with Hashem. We talked about it being a sense of bonding, a meeting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a number of different ways that theme was highlighted by a number of different mefarshim. What we're going to do today is really highlight a number of other approaches. These approaches are really more within the theme of what we saw last week, which is that the approach to davening here is not that we are looking to get something from HaKadosh Baruch Hu per se, even though that might be an important aspect. That is not what we're going to highlight today, but rather that davening has an effect on us. The process of tefillah, the experience of tefillah affects us in various different ways that are important for our avodat Hashem and our own life in general. So the first approach that I want to discuss today is an approach that's highlighted by a number of different mefarshim, which is that one of the reasons that and again, I want to just highlight as well, when we ask the question, ultimately, why do we daven? The answer is for all these reasons. Okay, this isn't none of these reasons are mutually exclusive, but when we highlight different approaches, it helps us, I think, at different times in our lives or at different moments during tefillah, tap into different themes that I think can be meaningful. And of course, there is going to even be some overlap between the different ideas, but to me, I think sometimes when we formulate them in different ways, again, it can create more meaning. So the approach here that I want to highlight now is that one of the reasons that we daven is it reminds us and it shows us our dependence on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we'll start with source number one. This is a paragraph from the Maharal, Sefer Netivot Olam. And he says the following, source number one, Perak Kama de Tanis, in the first parak in Tanit, quotes the Gemara that we've mentioned a few times. Tanya, the Braita says, the pasuk says, La'ahava et Hashem Elokechem uli avdo, to love Hashem and to serve Him. Says the Gemara, Zu tefillah. This is a reference, La'avdo means tefillah. Ask the Gemara, O eno ela avoda, maybe it's referring to either korbanos, or maybe it's referring to some kind of avoda, actual work. Talmud lomar b'chol levavchem. It says, as a continuation, that you should serve Hashem with all of your heart. Ezu avodah shehi belev, which avodah is with our heart. Have omer zet tefillah, that is tefillah. And therefore the Gemara concludes that tefillah, or the reference to tefillah in the Torah is the word avodah. Hare tefillah avodah el Hashem yisparach, which means that tefillah is an act of avodah. Continues the Maharal. Why is it called avodah? Why is tefillah called avodah? Now, avodah can mean service. Avodah can mean a sense of avdut, servitude. Now, servitude sometimes has a certain negative connotation, but here it might reference the fact that we are dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We owe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So says the Maharal, Ma shenikra hatefillah avodah. Why is tefillah called avodah? For the reason we said above, ki hatfila shemitpalel adam el Hashem yitbarach, the tefillah that a person davens to Hashem, moreh sheha adam nitlebo yitbarach v'tzarich elav ve'ein lo kiyum zulato. When we daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we ask Him for things, or we praise Him, all the different aspects of tefillah, the fact that we're doing that shows that we are dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are nitleba, we depend on Him, and we need Him, and that our existence wouldn't exist without Him. And so, but the fact that we turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu 3 times a day, and ask for certain things, and even just spend that time praying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that itself, says the Maharal, shows us that we depend on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is important for us to remind ourselves of. V'hine zehu elakuto yitbarach, and this is the godliness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shekol hanimtzaim tzrichim elav utzluyim bo yitbarach ad shehakol el Hashem yitbarach. And this is the godliness, is the fact that everybody, that all of us need HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the fact that we're dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu for our existence and for everything that we have, that itself is an important theme that is highlighted in tefillah, and that's why he says it's called avoda. You only serve, or you only turn to somebody who you're dependent on, to somebody who you need. An eved is dependent on their master. A servant is dependent on their master for all the things that they do. So when we talk about ourselves as Avdei Hashem, which is what tefillah is highlighting, and in the phrase avoda, what we're basically highlighting is that we depend on HaKadosh Baruch Hu for what we have. And so I think here the idea is, again, tefillah serves as a reminder to all of us when we daven that who we're supposed to turn to for everything, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this theme is actually highlighted in a number of different places and answers a number of different questions that some of the various Mefarshim ask. The Sefer Shvilei HaEmunah in source number 2. Shvilei HaEmunah is an interesting work. It was written by Rabbi Meir Eben Al-Dabi. He's from Toledo. It's become a relatively well-known work within the world of tefillah, the work of Perush of tefillah. And he asks a very interesting question. I mean, it's a fundamental question that many of us, that we've raised before. And he answers it based on this theme. Source number 2. V'im yish'al. Shoel, if someone were to ask, V'yomar, me'achar shehu yitbarach eno mishtaneh l'shum inyan shebe'olam. Since we know God doesn't change, right? God is perfect. God doesn't change. So when we talk about, again, this is one of the things we've talked about before, is what does it mean when we try to change God's will? Can we change God's will? So it says the Shvilei HaEmunah, his approach is, of course we can change God's will. God's perfect. We're not going to change what he wants to do. Ve'eno ohavo lazeh, velo soneh lazeh. He doesn't love this person and hate this person. Those are physical human attributes. Ela shehakol lefi koach haneshama. Rather, says the Shvilei HaEmunah, everything that we get or what we receive in this world is based on our own level of what he's referring to as koach haneshama, based on what we're meant to get, based on our soul. Something we're supposed to get based on our level, based on who we are, and whatever we receive from God is based on that. Kishehu overet b'mitzarev kimosh nitba'er. Im kain, ma to'elet b'tfilot b'tachanunim she'anu mitpalalim b'mitchanenim. So then, why are we turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and davening and asking for things if HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't going to change? This is one of the questions we've been asking. And there are different approaches to this. The Shvilei HaEmunah has a very interesting approach. He says, Imanu Efer, if we are just nothing, meaning, who are we? Heich anu, or dust, exactly, thank you. Heich anu mitpalalim shenachzor v'niyeh zahav. If we're supposed to get X, and that's who we are, and that's based on our level, that's what we're supposed to receive. So who are we to then be, if we're dust, as he says, who are we to be asked to be treated like gold? Everything we're going to receive, says the Shvilei HaEmunah, is based on the level of our neshama, the level of our soul, and whatever we're going to get, we're going to get. So what's the purpose in davening to Hashem and asking for things if HaKadosh Baruch Hu isn't going to change? Im kein ma to'elet lanu lomar slach shenemar shlach lanu avinu ki chadanu v'arei anu yodim she'anu tmeim u'min adin liyotenu kelim v'nifsadim ki ma'asenu gormim v'akol lefi ha'maseh. Why are we turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and saying shlach lanu avinu if it's all based on us? It's all dependent on us and the level that we're at. So then what's the purpose in us turning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? HaKadosh Baruch Hu won't change his mind. So again, we've seen different approaches to this, and this is only one approach. The Shvilei HaEmunah says, Im nomar she'mishtaneh la'achar tefillah, harei zeh shinui gadol, she'ein shinui gadol mimenu. And if we're going to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu changes after our davening, that's not something that's realistic. Neshivda, ki ma she'anu mitpalalim utzoakim liborei yisbarach, lo liyoto yisbarach mishtaneh meratzon leratzon, ela kishe'adam sho'el me'et boro mazon uparnasa, harei me'id sheyesh le'olam borei, nosei et hakol, when we daven, we are testifying and giving testimony to the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. And when we do that, we ourselves change. We ourselves grow in our own awareness and in our own spiritual level through that knowledge. And that is ultimately what helps us when we're talking about, and that is the goal, he says, of tefillah.
It's a terrible approach. It means Shemona Esrei is a waste of time. And there's plenty of evidence in the Torah that God does change.
So you're asking two different questions. First of all, I would argue that if we kept this approach, first of all, I'm not sure I agree with you that it's a terrible approach. I think it's one approach to this idea. The question of whether or not, therefore, Shemona Esrei is a waste of time, I'm not sure I agree. Meaning, I think that again, we're seeing different approaches, and I think many of them have validity in different ways. I think that the idea that when we say Shemona Esrei, part of what we're trying to do is change ourselves as opposed to simply receive from God. I don't think that's a waste of time. I think that's very valid.
For health and
Yes, part of that is, and he's actually going to go on to say that if we didn't daven every single day for Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, we wouldn't be aware of the fact that maybe we need to be aware of our sins. When we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Barech Aleinu Hashem Elokeinu, part of what the goal is here is for us to remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is ultimately the one who's going to give us our parnasah, or that we're dependent on Him for that parnasah. Meaning, it's some of this, and I do believe this is true, that some of this is about awareness of where it's coming from. Or I would even say something else. This isn't what he's saying, but I think it's an extension of what he's saying. Part of the theme of why again, we're going to get to this hopefully by the time in the future. Why is there a set text? Why do we say the things that we say? Why can't we just get up and daven what we want? Every person has things that he wants. Part of what we're trying to do in Shemona Esrei and in many of these things is these are the themes that Chazal want us to daven for. Why? Because these are the things we should be davening for. Meaning, if most of us got up and just davened for the things that were important to us, we focus on our personal things. Maybe if there was an issue of refuah in the family, maybe we'd say rifa'enu. If not, we wouldn't say rifa'enu. How many of us would say slach lanu avinu ki chatanu if we didn't have it in the text? How many of us would say Yerushalayim ircha barachamim tashuv v'tishkon b'tochach? So I do believe that a big part of what's being accomplished is not simply what we're asking for, but that it's a process of ourselves of learning what's important and priorities.
Also the idea of crying out to God when we're in trouble.
Absolutely.
You're saying that's pointless too.
Again, so he's very strong in his language where he talks about how there's very little that comes. I'm not sure that I would agree 100%. I agree with what you're saying. Meaning, I think there's different approaches to that initial question. The reason why I think it's important is that even if we were to say, let's say we would agree with him that nothing changes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we change, and that itself can have a difference. Meaning, this is an important point. There are many approaches that say that the part of the goal of tefillah and part of what we're trying to do in tefillah is change ourselves. And when we change ourselves, then the result of what's going to happen can still be impacted. Meaning, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't necessarily change His will; we change who we are, and therefore the din of what's going to happen to us is going to shift dependent on that. So you're right; he's very strong in his language, and I'm not sure that everyone would agree to that. But again, it's a tough question to deal with, which is what does it mean that God changes? But I believe what he's highlighting is that even if we were under the impression that we don't understand exactly, does God change will? Does His will change? Does His will not change? There's still an impact, and that's the highlight for me. There's still an impact that this has on who we are, and when we change, that also has an impact on the entire dynamic. Yes, sorry, there was a question in the back. Sorry, yeah.
No, I'm just thinking in Briat HaOlam, Hashem makes everything stay below the ground potential.
Correct. Until we ask for it. Correct.
In a certain way, I'm not exactly sure how Hashem wants our tefillah.
Absolutely. There's no question. We've seen that before. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants our tefillot. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants our tefillot, and as we saw before, built into the way the world is created is a requirement for those tefillot. The question just is, what are our tefillot meant to accomplish? And I think there's various levels of what our tefillot are meant to accomplish. On one level, we saw tefillot are how we receive things, or how we get them, even things we're supposed to get, how we receive them. On another level, what tefillot don't just do is not just become a way for us to receive things, they also become a way through how we improve ourselves, and how we become aware of the things that are important to us. We're able to highlight important themes and important ideas, and that's what I think the highlight is here. I think, again, these aren't mutually exclusive. It's not like we're saying we're not davening to Hashem to get things. Of course we're davening to Kadosh Baruch Hu to receive things. That's a major part of tefillah. That's much of what it is. But I think it's much more than that. And I think by highlighting the different themes, the different approaches, it helps us just see different approaches to tefillah.
One phrase, I think, that Hashem wants us to be part of the world, to be part of what's going on.
Absolutely.
Tefillah is
Absolutely, correct. Is our meaning? That's how we. That absolutely, 100%, 100%, and I think God wants us to struggle with that. 100, I agree, 100%. The question just is, what are the different things that we're accomplishing through that? Yes.
If a person's chas v'shalom very sick, then very often people add a name Chaim or Raphael or something. Are we fooling Hashem? Like the person is a different person, therefore cure.
So it's an excellent question. I can't say I know authoritatively the idea behind it, but as I understood, part of the idea behind the changing of the name is similar to what we're saying right now, which is we're changing the idea by adding that person's name. on a metaphysical level, that person is now somebody new. And even if, let's say, again, I'm oversimplifying the idea, but on a basic level, the idea would be that we're kind of, by giving him a name, he's now a new person. And therefore, if the Gzeirah was supposed to go to this person, we're now, and that's the theme of what a lot of people talk about, which is that we're not changing Hashem, but we change ourselves. If I'm supposed to receive X, or I wasn't supposed to receive X, but because of the tefillah, I change who I am, so maybe that Gzeirah won't apply to X, that applied to X doesn't apply to Y. And that's, I think, the theme that he's highlighting here, which is we're changing ourselves more than we're trying to change, quote-unquote, God's will. Yes?
I think what you're saying is that it's chinuch. It is basically instruction. It gives us direction.
Educational. Correct.
It gives us humility.
Yes.
It gives us humility. It gives us, and in a sense, maybe it even gives us hope and support in knowing that there's some sort of stability.
Well, that's 100%. Yes, I think what you're highlighting as well is when we talk about the fact that realizing and remembering that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is who we're dependent on, so that gives us a certain level of comfort. Absolutely, right? The ABCs of any kind of a relationship is you need that relationship needs to have a certain foundation to it. I remember hearing again. I always compare a lot of talks to parenting. I remember hearing one time from Rabbi Dr. Pelkovitz when I was in Smicha in my rabbinic training in YU. That every parent needs to give their child two L's: love and limits. Okay, unending love, but there needs to be a foundation. There needs to be a basis to that relationship because every child, even if they pretend like they don't want it, they all want that limits because the subconscious thing, what you're telling them is, I care about you, and even when the kid fights you about it from today till tomorrow, ultimately when you give them limits. So I agree with you. I think that when we talk about this isn't just about a lesson for us in terms of reminding us. It's also meant to hopefully give us a certain sense of comfort that we have someone to rely on. We have someone who cares about us. 100%. Yasher koach. Yeah, I think we're good. We're good to go on.
When I grew up in America, I had my name. My parents gave me the Naftali Ben Yitzhak, okay, which was my great grandfather. Okay, and it was a very.
That's the Netziv.
And he was B'nai Yisachar. On Shabbat, he wrote down everything. And I grew up with Neil Stewart. They tried to. Was interesting. Neil Stewart was connected to Naftali Tzvi.
Yeah. A lot of people do that. Okay.
And when I came here, I decided to call myself Naftali Tzvi.
Beautiful.
Okay, so that's Really
so the name, you're talking about the impact of the name change. Yes, I agree. But what he's highlighting here again is that, just to get back to this specific point, is that when we daven, we're reminding ourselves and we're remembering that we depend on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Just getting to the next highlighted part. We're not going to read the whole thing because of time. The next underlined part in source number 2. Ilu lo hayinu omrim batfilot slach lanu o mechal lanu. Had we not said every day, 3 times a day, slach lanu o mechal lanu, or forgive us, v'lo hayinu mazkirim an inyanim elu, we wouldn't remember these things. We wouldn't mention these things. La'olam lo hayinu margishim ba'asotenu haraot. Then when we went through the rest of our day, we would be less sensitive to, are we sinning? Meaning, this is an important point. How many of us say slach lanu and then forget about it after 3 minutes? Okay? And what's he saying? No, that's not the purpose. Slach lanu is meant to be from now until the next time I daven. Every time I'm about to do a sin, why? I just daven for forgiveness, which means I have to be sensitive to how I act and to who I am. Okay? Aval biyotenu tamid nichlamim ala avonotenu. But if we're constantly saying, slach lanu, I sinned, I did something wrong, then that's meant to impact us throughout the day to be more aware of our actions. Ala avonenu mivakshim slicha, asking for slicha, v'tachanonim al she'avarnu, lo nashiv lachzor u'larshia. Basically, to remind us that we're not going to come back and do it again. And he goes on to say the same thing. V'chein ilu lo ayinu mitpalim mivakshim imenu mazon. Had we not had a tefillah where we're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for support, Baruch then we would forget that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the source. So every single thing that we do, even in the Shemona Esrei, all the different parts of Tefillah, or at least one aspect of the Tefillah, is to remind us of all the different aspects that we're dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to hopefully get us to think about those things throughout the day. In source number 3, Sefer Beit Elokim, again another less well-known Sefer, Rav Moshe Bar Yosef Mitrani. He was one of the Chachmei Tzfat in the 16th century. So he has a Sefer called Sha'ar HaTfilah. And he comes at this from a different angle. But he asks, again, another very important question, which we're going to also get to in the future. Uvazeh yituratz davar kaseh b'inyan HaTfilah. He says, now with this theme, we can understand something very important and challenging. something hard to understand when it comes to tefillah. Shenira davar bilti hagun v'na'eh. It seems totally inappropriate. Lish'ol she'ela achat kama pe'amim. To go up to somebody and constantly ask for the same thing over and over and over again. If you were to go up to a king and ask him for something, and he would be like, okay, push you away. And then you go back to 2 hours later and ask again. And then ask again. And every day you were to go and ask again, that person would just kick you out and throw you away.
Yeah, but when your children ask you the same thing, that, eventually you give in.
Not always. Not always. I'd like to think that I tried to a point, but that's a good point that they wear you down. That won't work with God. When you're dealing with real authority, if the person wants to give it to you after the first couple of times, they'll give it to you. Hefzer means like when you're pleading, hu davar mutar umazik motar. It's extra and it actually hurts the person who's constantly asking the question. V'anu mitpalalim lakel b'kol yom erev v'avoker v'tzarayim tefillah aleph yudchet brachot shetiknu. Imke v'gam ki ein anachnu ne'anim berubam. We're not answered. We don't know if we're answered. That's part of the challenge of tefillah. Ein anu nimna'im milomrim b'chol yom. So how is it that it's appropriate for us to turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu every single day, 3 times a day, and ask for the same thing over and over and over again? Okay? Now we're going to see another answer to this shortly, later on in this shiur. But the answer that he gives, that Beit Elokim gives, is it's not just. The purpose is not simply to ask for those things. It's to remind us. It's the impact when we ask for these things, the role it has on who we are. Ella. Shekavanat hatfilah, we're in the underlined part in source number 3. Hilahakir uleharot ke'ein be'olam lemi shera'oi lehitpalel ki'im lakel yitbarach. It highlights for us that who is meant to be our address for each and every one of these things? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shehu adon lechol ha'olam v'she'anachnu chaserim mikama dvarim hamuskarim batfilah. And to recognize and realize that we're missing these things, and that the person or the being that we're meant to turn to for all of these things is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vanu zochrim otam lefanav kidei shenakir she'ein mi sheyachol lesapek tzarkenu, in order to recognize and to show that we have no one else to turn to for these things, ulahatzilenu mikol tzaratenu, to save us from all of our challenges. Ki'im hakel yitbarach ve'alav anu mashlichim yavenu, and we're throwing all of our desires and everything that we want to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, asking Him. V'anachnu yotzim yidei chavotenu behitpalel al hakavana azot v'Hashem hatov be'einav yaseh. And by doing this, we're asking, and we're doing what we're trying to do. We're doing ours, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will decide what He's going to decide. Im lekabel tfilatenu im hi haguna im lav, whether it's appropriate or not. And so therefore, again, this answers one of our a very important question, which is one of the reasons that we constantly ask for the same thing is because it's not simply about asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's also because it reminds us on a daily basis, 3 times a day, these are the things that we want, these are the things that should be important to us, and who should we be turning to receive these things? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yes, please.
So when each of the Ziv brings a different korban, you say, why the same korban? Why does the Torah have to repeat each one? Because they had different machshavot.
Excellent.
And I find in davening the same thing, that depending on what's happening to me during the day, even though I'm saying
same words,
I have a different machshavot.
Excellent. You're adding another point to it, which is meant to highlight the brilliance of Chazal, which is that Chazal established a certain text that, of course, can mean different things to different people, and can mean different things to the same person depending on what's going on in your own life. 100%. That's a beautiful idea, and that's 100% true as well. Which means it's not as repetitive as it seems like it might be, because at different times in our lives, at different times in our day, at different times in our week or our year, whatever's going on, it might have different meaning, and that's part of the beauty of what Chazal instituted as well. 100%. Thank you. Okay, so that's one approach. One approach we've seen today, which is that the purpose of tefillah is simply to remind us and to verbalize who we are dependent on. Okay. The next approach, again, is a similar approach in that the purpose of tefillah is that it impacts us, but it comes from a little bit of a different angle. And the basis for this is actually from a couple of psukim in the Torah. The first pasuk comes in Sefer Shemos, and this is in Parshat Mishpatim. Again, seemingly totally irrelevant for our purposes, but you'll see it's relevant soon. V'chinatzu anashim. The Torah describes when 2 people are fighting. V'nikfu isha hara, and one of them accidentally knocks into or hits or injures a woman who is pregnant. V'yatzu yiladeha, and the fetus comes out. V'lo yiason, if nobody is killed. Anosh ye'anesh, then he should get punished, meaning he has to pay for whatever damages are done, but no one's killed. He doesn't have to get punished with killing. Kasher yashit alav bala isha, whenever the husband of the wife, if he brings him to court, he has to pay. Vinatan biflilim. And the question is, what does biflilim mean? And there's a number of different interpretations. Rashi, right there on the spot, quotes the simple understanding is Natan means he should give with flilim. Says Rashi, al yedei hadayanim. Plilim, the word plilim is a reference to judges. And that the judges, based on whatever judgment the judge gives, that's what the person needs to pay. So we see here already the word palel, pay, lamed, which is the root also of the word, according to some, the root of the word tefillah, means judges. Let's see a similar idea in Sefer Bereshis. Now getting to the story of where Yosef and Yaakov reunite for the first time after 17 years of being apart. Vayomer Yisrael el Yosef, re'o fanecha lo filalti. I never, to see your face, lo filalti. We'll see what that means in a second. V'hinei hareoti elokim gam et zarecha. Now God has not only shown me you, but He's even shown me your children. What does it mean, lo filalti? Again, a number of different interpretations. Rashi quotes, lo filalti means lo danti bilibi. I did not even think or judge in my heart that there was a chance that I was going to see you. Yaakov is basically saying, it never occurred to me. But again, using a language of din, of dayanut. Says Rashi, kol pilul lashon din. Vayamod Pinchas vayifalel asat nikama. That's a pasuk, I believe, in Tehillim, that Pinchas got up and he judged, and then he took revenge. Based on this, the main proponent of this approach is Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch points out and suggests that what is the purpose of tefillah? The root of the word tefillah, palel, means to judge. The purpose of tefillah is what he calls self-judgment. The goal of tefillah is that every single day we stand up and we daven, and we test and we challenge ourselves and we judge ourselves. What are our values? Are we living up to our values? We take a few moments to step out of daily life and to judge. Now, he doesn't focus on God judging us. He focuses on what he calls self-judgment. And by the way, he notes that the classic word for tefillah, hitpalel, is what we would call reflexive, which means it's going on the person. It's meant an action. You're not doing an action to somebody else. You're doing the action to yourself. Look at source number 6. Hitpalel, this is in Chorev, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's famous sefer. Hitpalel, from which tefillah is derived, originally meant to deliver an opinion about oneself, to judge oneself, or an inner attempt at doing so, such as the hitpalel form of the Hebrew verb frequently denotes. In other words, an attempt to gain a true judgment of oneself. Thus it denotes to step out of active life in order to attempt to gain a true judgment of oneself, that is about one's ego, about one's relationships to God and the world, and of God and the world to oneself. It strives to infuse mind and heart with the power of such judgment as will direct both anew to active life purified, sublimated, and strengthened. The procedure of arousing such self-judgment is called tefillah. Tefillah is an act where we stand there and we ask ourselves, as we're davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, am I living up? What are my values? Am I living up to those values? All the things that I want. Where am I in my relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Relationship to my fellow Jews, relationship to myself. That is the overall goal of tefillah. Rav Hirsch highlights this as well in another one of his famous works, 19 Letters. I brought it again because I believe that the language that he uses is very, very, very important. Tefillah involves, source number 7, tefillah involves stepping away from our daily life with all its activities in order to regain those truths which we ought to have taken to heart in our lives, but which we let slip away because of the deceptions, confusion, conflicts, and temptations of living. Avodah shebalev is what our sages call it. The realization of the divine will by our inner self, that is self-elevation and self-purification. Tefillah, prayer, represents the endeavor to arrive at an accurate assessment of ourselves in relation to God, the world, and man. The purpose of words of prayer, tefillah, is lehitpalel, purification, illumination, uplifting of our inner self toward recognition of the truth. Not an emotional, fleeting devotion, a momentary ecstasy, a flood of tears, which again are also important, but a cleansing, of the thoughts and of the heart. Life robs us of accurate discernment of God, the world, mankind, and Israel, and of our own relationship to them. By transcending life, by ascending toward God, we can retrieve this discernment in tefillah. Now, it's interesting to note, by the way, that some of the language that's being used here, self-purification, is similar to some of the things we saw before. We talked last class about connecting to God, how it purifies us. But the language is just a little bit different, and the imagery is very, very different. Whereas there, it was about bonding with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and connecting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that leads to the self-purification. Here, the language and the imagery that's being used is almost a self-judgment. It's a process through which we ourselves are asking the questions and trying to understand whether we are achieving what we're trying to achieve. And refers, by the way, in I believe it's there, continues and points out that the word that we use for a Beit Knesset in English and really in German is shul. And he says the word shul comes from the word, actually is from the word school. Okay, because the purpose of a shul is to teach you, is to teach us lessons, is to help us understand the things that we're supposed to and the values that we're supposed to attain. That's like a classic Rav Hirsch type of point. That because davening is really a school for those who have outgrown the classic school and are trying to maintain that sense of perspective. I brought you also just one other, just to highlight this point again. Source number 8, this is an introduction to the Art Scroll Siddur, where, again, he highlights this point that the purpose of tefillah is it's meant to be an introspective process. Prayer, then, source number 8, is not a list of requests. It is an introspective process, a clarifying, refining process of discovering what one is, what he should be, and how to achieve that transformation. Indeed, the commandment to pray is expressed by the Torah as a service of the heart, not of the mouth. To the extent that we improve ourselves with prayer, we become, we become capable of absorbing God's blessing. But the blessings depend on each person's mission. In this welter of contradictions, man needs all his inner strength as a Jew and bearer of Torah to ward off the attacks on his faith. We may enter adulthood with the idealism of youth and the faith ingrained by parents and teachers, but life incessantly, hits at them. Modern society has learned that people burn themselves out if they never withdraw to relax and regain perspective and inner strength. What makes us think we can fight the moral war demanded by God without removing ourselves from the trenches every now and then to regain our perspective and the purpose and strategy of the battle? And so again, the purpose of tefillah, according to this approach, is taking a step out of the busyness of the world to help judge ourselves, to help reflect upon ourselves and whether we're accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish. So that's the second approach that we've seen today. The first approach we've seen today was that the purpose is to remind us of the fact that we're dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The second approach is it's about self-judgment, gaining perspective, introspection, understanding and asking and trying to take a step back a few times a day and ask whether we're living up to the values that we've set up for ourselves. The third approach that I wanted to bring for you today is a little bit more of a mystical, I guess, you call it a mystical approach, an interesting approach that I found that I thought was very, very interesting. Once again, based on a different interpretation of what the word filalti is. We talked about how when Yaakov sees Yosef, he says, just to quote the exact words, Ra'o fanecha lo filalti, to see your face, I didn't, and filalti at that point we said meant judge, or I didn't expect. So, excuse me, I just want to make sure that I got the right quote here. Oh, so earlier I had quoted the Rashbam, not the Rashi. Rashi brings a different approach, source number 9. What does it mean, filalti? Lo mila'ani libi lachshov. The word filalti means thought. I didn't think that I was going to see you. Machshava she'er'eh panecha, falalti lashon machshava. So as before, the Rashbam pointed out that the word filalti meant judgment. Rashi points out that the word filalti means thought. Based on this, there's a very, very interesting perspective that the Sefer Avodat Halev. Avodat Halev was written by Aryeh Lev Goldin. He was a very interesting personality, and he wrote a commentary on Tefillah called Avodat Halev. It's brought in a siddur called Otzar HaTfilot. And he makes the following suggestion. Based on the interpretation that falel, the word palel means thought, he suggests that the purpose of tefillah is to help us organize and separate the various thoughts that come into our mind. Source number 10. Asher yir'eli bazeh. I would like to suggest the following, he says. Ki hashoresh palel hunach betchila lehoraot beirur hamachshavot haolot al halev be'irbuvia. He says the purpose of tefillah is to help us organize, discern, distinguish between the various mixture of thoughts that we have in our minds throughout our lives and throughout our day. I'm sure many of us understand this. Our minds are all over the place. Everything that's, and especially in a world where they're constantly being stimulated by various things around us. And therefore, when a person, and sometimes those thoughts can be contradictory, they can be confusing, just like emotions can be contradictory and confusing. And the purpose of tefillah is to help you step back and try to control or organize, or the way he's going to say in a second, distinguish and separate the different thoughts and the different feelings that you have. And he says the purpose is you have these thoughts that ha'olot ala lev be'irbuvya, they're all mixed up. Ve'havdalat machshava achat mi bein chevrotea. And the purpose of tefillah is to push away all those unnecessary or external thoughts, machshavot, and to focus on the important machshavot that you believe to be the most important for you. Ve'im echrech Yosher, either you come to that conclusion because of higayon, because of logic, v'hu mishpat hatzodek, o b'derech hashara ba'alma, or just simply by focusing on trying to think about the different thoughts, one of them ends up, coming out and distinguishing itself amongst the other. Biot achat mehen krova el hamitziut yoter mikulan, because whatever, as you think about it, you focus on them. One ultimately, this happens a lot. We try to come to a decision on different things, and we have lots of different ideas of which one. Let's say we have a big decision to make. So some people are very practical. They'll sit and they'll write down lists and I should do this. Other people just need time to think it through. And that if you spend enough time thinking about it, that doesn't work for everybody. Some people, the more they think about it, the more they get confused. But sometimes thinking can do is you just, by letting yourself just sit and think about it, one of them becomes clearer to you than the other. And that's what he's describing here as the focus of tefillah. And it's interesting the way he describes how this fit in to Yaakov. Continuing.
What's the word hikion mean?
I'm sorry?
What's the word hikion mean?
Hegyon means logic. The fourth line, we're in the fourth line in the middle of the line. He now quotes from the story of Yaakov and Yosef. What did Yaakov mean when he said, Ra'o fanecha lo filalti? To see your face, I never thought. He doesn't say lo shafatati, I didn't judge. Lo sha'arti. Lo shafatati v'lo sha'arti kirot panecha. I didn't think, or I didn't judge to see your mind. Ve'ilu amar lo chashafti, lo damiti, lo alta alibo. Had he said the word lo chashafti, I didn't think I'd ever see you. Lo damiti, I never imagined I didn't see you. Lo alta libi, it never occurred to me that I would see you. Then what that meant was, we would know, hayiti omer shekvar nityaesh mimenu lagamre, excuse the typo again. That would have meant that Yaakov had totally forgotten about Yosef and basically said, I'm never going to see him again. V'hisiach zichron mikerev libo v'yishkacheyu. He would have basically pushed him out of his mind. But we know that that's not true. Why do we know that that's not true? Aval be'emet lo kain, because it said, the pasuk says, ki me'ein lehitnachem. Yaakov refused to be comforted. Chazal say, why did Yaakov refuse to be comforted? Lefi she'ein mekablim tamchumin al hachai. Because we have a concept that you're not going to be comforted for someone who is still alive. And so says Rabbi Aryeh Leib Goldin, what happened with Yaakov? What Yaakov is establishing here is he didn't just push Yosef out of it and forget about him. He was confused. There were moments where he would, and he even points out in the words themselves, Lifamim haya omer sheyosef enenu. If you follow the language in the text, sometimes Yaakov says, Yosef enenu. What does enenu mean? He's not here, he's gone, he died. V'lo amar, enenu, excuse me, enenu means he's not here, but doesn't mean v'lo amar mate. He didn't say he's died, he's missing. Okay? Other times, Lifamim haya omer ki achiv mate. He died. So meaning, Yaakov himself, as we see in the different languages, had different thoughts coming to him. There were moments where he would think about it and he would come to the conclusion, Yosef's dead. Other times he would come to the conclusion, wait, there's hope. I haven't seen him, but it doesn't mean he's gone. And so Yaakov had all these different minds. And what Yaakov is saying now when he sees Yosef is, I had all these different minds and I didn't know which one was right. I didn't know to separate one from the other. And only now when I see you, Yosef, am I able to come to the right conclusion. And then he points out, Rabbi Goldin points out that why do we use the same language of plilim for judges? Because what is the job of a dayan, of a judge? To take different thoughts, different claims, and to discern which one is correct. And that's why we have the same language here. And that he goes on to say that is the purpose of tefillah. The purpose of tefillah is we approach our tefillah with our mind swirling from all the things that are going on in our lives. And the purpose of tefillah is to help us be able to separate what is real, what is pure, what is really who we are, and what is external to who we are and what we want to be. And that is, again, the purpose of tefillah. And the way he describes it is we then take those pure machshavot and we give them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We bring them to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the act of tefillah. This idea is highlighted as well by Rabbi Abraham J. Twersky, where he points out the same idea, that the purpose of tefillah, following in the footsteps of the Avodat Halev, is to distinguish and to be able to discern between different thoughts. Source number 11. The author of Avodat Halev points out that palel can mean to clarify and to distinguish. The function of a judge is to analyze the facts brought before him, and by distinguishing truth from falsehood, he clarifies the issue that is disputed by the litigants. Tefillah is, therefore, a process whereby a person should distinguish among the slew of thoughts that fill his mind. Tefillah is a clarification and a resolution of the confusion that conflicts that reverberate in our minds. And I'm sure many of us can relate to this. That's why you're not supposed to enter tefillah out of a sense of out of chaos, because when you have chaos, it's very hard to then organize your thoughts. This concept of tefillah sheds additional light on kavana, which, as we have seen, is variously translated as intention. Kavana has yet another additional meaning. The word kivun means direction. By divesting ourselves of extraneous thoughts through the clarifying aspect of tefillah, we can identify and single out the proper kivun, direction, we should be taking. And then he adds something very important. We can now understand the idea why the pious people of yesteryear would spend a full hour preparing for tefillah. Why would they spend, we always know the Hasidim Rishonim spend an hour preparing for tefillah. Why would they spend an hour preparing for tefillah? Because the purpose of being able to separate and do this process of tefillah requires, that itself requires preparation. Eliminating all extraneous thoughts that may divert a person's attention is the most difficult task. These thoughts have a way of intruding upon a person and distracting him from his concentration. Is it possible for a person to totally focus his thoughts and avoid distraction? Of course. A tightrope walker thinks of nothing other than maintaining his delicate balance. At other times, his mind may be diverted in a variety of directions. But when he is walking a tightrope hundreds of feet in the air, he knows that any distraction may cause him to lose his balance and fall to his death. Because his life is at stake, his thoughts are on nothing other than maintaining his balance. It may seem too much to ask of a person, but if we understand that our bonding with God to be vital, we could attain a singularity of attention and concentration similar to that of a tightrope walker. And so, again, the purpose of tefillah is to help us organize our thoughts and clarify things. And when I read this idea and I studied this idea based on these different sources, it reminded me of another book that I had once read about tefillah. And this was a book by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, for those who don't know, was a huge Talmid Chacham, lived in America in the late 20th century. Wrote many books. He was versed in all different areas of Torah. And he has a book that I remember reading in yeshiva called Jewish Meditation. And his whole claim in that book was that much of what tefillah is all about is actually meant to be a meditation. If you look at source number 12, I just brought a few excerpts from it because I think it highlights the same idea. Because the idea of controlling your thoughts, that's exactly what meditation, sometimes we think meditation is like sitting there with our legs crossed and our arms. Meditation is really just about being able to learn how to control your mind and control your thoughts. Source number 12. One of the most powerful benefits of meditation is control over the unconscious mind. One learns to use the unconscious mind to control mental processes that are usually under the control of the unconscious. Gradually, more and more of the subconscious becomes accessible to the conscious mind, and one gains control of the entire thought process. Sometimes different parts of the mind appear to be acting independently. The conflict between two parts of the mind can be so strong that a person can feel like separate individuals. During such inner conflict, it seems that one part of the mind wants to do one thing while the other wants to do something else. Sometimes not two, but 3, 4, or more voices seem to be giving different signals in the mind. If a person were to learn to control his subconscious, he could avoid much of this conflict. In many schools, this self-mastery is one of the most important goals of meditation. And elsewhere, he goes on to note, and we'll read a couple of these paragraphs, to note that this was actually, there's many sources to the fact that even the earlier times of davening, the earlier sources of tefillah, reference the concept of meditation. There's ample evidence that meditative practices were widespread amongst Jews throughout Jewish history. References to meditation are found in major texts in every period from the biblical to the pre-modern era. One reason that this has not been universally recognized is that the vocabulary of meditation has been lost to it could be true about vocabulary of medication, but has been lost to a large degree, especially during the last century. And then he goes on to say, we'll skip it for now, just you can read it on your own, but he goes on to suggest that is the source for the text that we have, the Amidah. The Amidah, you're meant to stand with your feet together, and you're meant to just be in a certain in one position for a long time, and that is the meditative technique. He suggests that's also why, to answer the question we saw earlier this morning, why is it that we say the same thing 3 times a day every single day? It's the same text over and over. Suggests Rabbi Kaplan, because that's what meditative techniques are all about. You repeat the same things over and over in order for them to be able to be seared into your consciousness or subconsciousness in a meaningful way. Yes. Good point. Correct. Yes, I think you're right. She said that instead of using the word meditative, today's lingo would be to use the word mindfulness. Now, I agree. I mean, I'm bringing texts that are more from the 1980s and the 1990s. That's where Rabbi Kaplan wrote the book. But you are correct. Mindfulness can mean a lot of different things. Mindfulness can be a reference to what we would call meditative techniques, or mindfulness can also just simply be a way that a person is more aware. Meaning, meditation usually does have a certain connotation of space, quiet, there's a certain way you can do meditation, but you're 100% right that the purpose of meditation is ultimately to make you aware of yourself and your subconscious and all of the things that you're pointing out. So yes, I think the goals are the same, and it might be just a different type of doing it, a different language in describing it. And I also think mindfulness is a more expansive type of approach. But yes, that's 100% the idea. Meaning the purpose of what we're suggesting here is we live in a world where we're just thrown in so many different places. The world is so busy. Part of what tefillah is meant to do is a way to just take that time quietly to be able to think about whether it's self-judgment or it's just self-reflection, the things that are important to us, and to highlight those things. Okay, we just have 2 more minutes. We're going to finish. I wanted to bring one more approach, and this is an approach that I had not seen until I saw it in Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Is a very interesting approach, and he points out, and the truth is that the main text for this is not in your source sheet, so you'll have to look at it, or you'll have to just trust me. But he suggests that what's the purpose of tefillah? The purpose of tefillah is to give back to Hashem. Now this is actually seems somewhat counterintuitive. What do you mean to give back to Hashem? How can we ever give something to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That's presumptuous to us to assume that we're going to give something to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yet, at the same time, we also know that the act of giving to somebody else itself creates a relationship that is extremely important. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks about this within the context of korbanot, and he then extends it to nowadays tefillah, which we know is in place of korbanot. I want to read you just 2 paragraphs because I think they're very important. How then do we come close to God? This part you don't have on your source sheets. I apologize. This is not on your source sheets. This is taken from the introduction to the Koren Siddur. There's that new Koren Siddur that come out with his Perush. There's a beautiful introduction that he wrote on many aspects of tefillah, and this is where this is from. How then do we come close to God? By an act of renunciation, by giving something away, specifically by giving something back. The sacrifices of the biblical age were ways in which the individual or the nation as a whole, in effect, said that what we have, God, is really yours. The world exists because of you. We exist because of you. Nothing we have is ultimately ours. The fundamental gesture of sacrifice is, on the face of it, absurd. What we give to God is something that already belongs to Him, right? We're just giving Him something that He gave to us. Yet to give back to God is one of the most profound instincts of the soul. Doing so, we acknowledge our dependency. We cast off the carapace of self-absorption. That is why, in one of our most striking phrases, the Torah speaks of sacrifice as being reach nichoach, a sweet savor to Hashem. One of the sweetest savors of parenthood is when a child, by now grown to maturity, being a parent, giving the parent a gift to express his or her thanks. This too seems absurd. What can a child give a parent that remotely approximates what a parent gives a child, namely life itself? Yet it is so, and the reverse is also true. The cruelest thing a child can do is not to acknowledge his or her parents. The Talmud attributes Rabbi Akiva the phrase Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. Those 2 words encapsulate the essence of Jewish worship. God is kingmaker and sovereign of the universe, yet even before God is our King, He is our Father, our parent, and one who brought us into being in love, who nurtured us and sustained us, who taught us His ways, and who tenderly watches over our destiny. Sacrifice, the gift we bring to God, is the gift of the maid to its maker, the owned to its owner, the child to its parent. If creation is an act of love, sacrifice is an acknowledgement of that love. And now you have the part that you have in your just a small paragraph. The difference between prayer as request and prayer as sacrifice is that request seeks, sacrifice gives. So now he's transitioning and suggesting that what is ultimately tefillah nowadays? One of the purposes of tefillah is to ask for things. The other purpose of tefillah is to give back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, similar to what was done in the times of the Korbanot. The prophets asked, usually on behalf of the people as a whole, for forgiveness, deliverance, and blessing. The priests who offered the sacrifices in the temple asked for nothing. Sacrificial prayer is the giving back to God what God already owns: our lives, our days, our world. Prayer is creation's gift to its creator. So with that, I'll just to highlight what we've seen today. We saw a number of different approaches to to finish up this introductory section on why we daven. We saw today a number of different approaches. One approach was the reason that we daven is to remind ourselves and to highlight for ourselves that we are dependent on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not what we're asking for from Hashem, but it's to remind us that God is the source of everything that we have. The second approach that we saw is that the reason why we daven is it's more of an act of self-reflection, self-judgment, from the word litpalel, which means reflexive. Litpalel means to judge ourselves. We're judging ourselves. What are our values? Are we standing up to the things that are important to us? The third approach we saw was that it's about controlling our thoughts, what you want to call meditation, mindfulness, the ability to separate all of the noise that exists within the world around us, and to be able to focus on those things that are important to us. And this last approach we saw from Rav Sachs was that we daven because it is an act of giving back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as he says, the act of the creation giving to his creator. So Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll continue in some of the more historical things about davening, focus more on, is tefillah a mitzvah? Interesting machlokes whether tefillah is an actual mitzvah or not, and we'll continue with that next week, Bezrat Hashem.